The death penalty. It sucks and we should abolish it. The death penalty has been in the United States law since the Europeans decided to settle within the Americas. The first ever recorded death penalty execution was in 1608 by Captain George Kendall in Jamestown, Virginia. Since the first execution, there have been multiple times where the death penalty has been instituted within the U.S. And as stated within the Death Penalty Information Organization, there are still over 27 states within the U.S. today that still establish the death penalty as an option of punishment. Some states include Alabama, Arizona, Georgia, Texas, and Utah, to name a few. But there are other states that don't have the death penalty now within their laws. These include states like Alaska, Colorado, Maine, and Michigan, to name a few. Now, before I go into why we should abolish the death penalty in the US, I should still mention that there are sources that do back the death penalty to be kept in our laws. For example, an article by Garrett Merriam suggests that abolishing the death penalty could cause more harm than good for innocent people who were convicted wrongfully. Merriam found in his research that there would be an increase in miscarriages of justice due to a surplus in oversight, which involves extra appeals from lawyers as well as extra hours for lawyers to try to defend their clients. Merriam also ran an experiment to see if there would be a difference between donations of resources from people if he were to question them if they would help an innocent person who's sentenced to die or a person who would be sentenced to life in prison. The results from this experiment found out that there was a 20% more people to give resources for innocent people sentenced to die compared to being sentenced in life in prison. Merriam's findings would suggest that the death penalty does have a positive outcome when it comes to protecting innocent people from being wrongfully sentenced to death. However, that's not the full story, as there are many resources suggesting that the death penalty does more harm than good. Such resources put insights on disparities like race and gender to be considered when putting people to death. Like in an article by the Journal of Ethnicity and Criminal Justice, researchers would study floor cases that would argue about death penalty sentences in regards to racial disparity. Their findings did suggest that there was racial disparities that was predictable within the arguments found in cases, and as well as there being an influence of racial partisanship, as well as the race and ethnicity of legislatures mattering to the cases being had. Another article, based on the Albany Law Review, had compared statistics that would compare the odds of executions based on factors like race and gender as well. And they found that there was implemented biases of race and gender within the sentencing of individuals. But outside of racial disparities, there are still other reasons as to why the death penalty would be deemed useless, like the decisions made by the Supreme Court over the lower courts. In a study made by the Columbia Human Rights Law Review, there was a comparison between court decisions made by the Supreme Court of the United States and lower courts. They found that the decision to sentence criminals to death was all based on the Supreme Court's decision, rather than the original decision made by the lower courts. This suggests that even if the lower courts decided to not implement the death penalty, the decision by the Supreme Court is able to bypass their decision, regardless of how the law was interpreted in the case. Now, aside from court decisions being overruled, as well as racial disparities being found in cases, there are other resources that suggest that the death penalty could be a thing of the past. A study by the International Journal of Criminal Justice Science would do an in-depth study to see how the death penalty was used internationally, as well as the United States. And what they had found was that the death penalty in court decision was used less and less, almost to the point of obscurity over the past few decades. That includes the United States. This could show that as a society in the United States, we are rearing away from the use of the death penalty when it comes to the proper punishment of these criminals. This claim is further backed by the same researchers in their article, The Philosophy of the Death Penalty, showing that criminals are sentenced more to life in prison than sentenced to death. And as stated once more by the Death Penalty Information Organization, states like California, Pennsylvania, and Oregon are putting moratoriums on the use of the death penalty in their states. The reason being is that they want to put more emphasis on other forms of punishment rather than putting inmates to death, which suggests that we're already trying to move away from the death penalty being used. At the end of the day, there is still discussion to be brought to the table when it comes to abolishing the death penalty. But I hope, based on the information that I brought to you today, gives you more insight on why, as a society in the United States, we should push away from implementing the death penalty any further and abolish it altogether as a whole. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk.